Okay, so Bitcoin finally made a move out of this over month-long horizontal channel, and it didn't break up, it broke down into a Black Monday. So what does this mean for the price? What's going to come next? Let's talk about this quickly in today's video. So as you can see, 4-hour time frame right here, disgusting Black Monday ensued as Bitcoin followed the path that the S&P 500 had been playing out for the past week or so, had a slight divergence snap back to reality. So it seems like Bitcoin is still following exactly what the S&P 500 is doing, and we're going to talk about that in just one second. But shedding some slight positivity after this big red candle today, Bitcoin is starting to form a really nice V-shaped recovery, and on the daily time frame it's already erased all of the negative gains from today. If you look on the daily, we have a massive doji candle right now after we fell to the downside of this range. We've pushed beneath the previous lows, we've pushed back up to retest this, and all of my pretty much support and resistance boxes are always in blue. But I've highlighted these two boxes here, the horizontal range that we were trading in yellow, because this is going to be the range that I want to see Bitcoin move back into in the short term. However, let's head over to the slightly higher time frame, shed some light on what just happened. Over on the daily, you can see previous support from all the way back here. We came back down today, touched this, and zipped right back up with that V-shaped recovery. Over on the weekly time frame as well, you can see we definitely wicked beneath this very important trend line from the previous all-time highs. Touch point, blasted through this, and we're currently bouncing on this right now. We're really just lollygagging on this at this moment in time. No major decision has been made, but it looks like we're really trying to hold these macro supports on the weekly time frame, which in the higher time frames is definitely a good sign, and I'll show you something super important a little bit later on. Over on the weekly right here, you can see we are hugging this trend line. This trend line here is quite ambiguous. You can draw it a couple of different ways, but the way that I've had it drawn, we are still holding it on the weekly time frame. This is really the point where you want to see a bounce, because we've come down, we've back tested kind of all of these regions, and this is, in my opinion, kind of looking like a swing failure pattern beneath the range with this V-shaped recovery. If we only just kind of look at this orange or yellow box that we've been trading in for quite some time right now, the only reason I'm not kind of like 100% convinced that we're kind of going to bounce on this and go back lower is that kind of every time we were in this range, the wicks above it, we got pushed back down. You can see swing failure pattern, got pushed back up, swing failure pattern, got pushed back down, swing failure pattern, pushed back down. This whole range, and yeah, you can draw a whole bunch of kind of trend lines on this to paint a bunch of different pictures, but the most black and white one is that we've been trading within this range. This has the most touch points, this has the most kind of resistance and support boxes that we've been trading in, especially within most recent times, and we have done kind of pretty much everything to push back above this and wreck the bulls, and push back beneath this and wreck the bears. In my opinion, Bitcoin's in a very interesting position where we're pushing kind of back up to this box, and what I would love to see is for us to start trading within this box again, because I think that's going to give us a strong case to rally back up to 90,000 in the event that that could happen. However, as we've been talking about on the channel, Bitcoin is really following the S&P 500, and the S&P 500 has been absolutely nuking the week prior, and we talked about the fact that kind of Bitcoin was diverging from that, and it has finally started to catch up. So clearly there's not really any decorrelation between these assets. Bitcoin is just lagging a little bit behind the S&P 500, and that's really what we're seeing at this moment in time. So coming over to the S&P 500, something that, to be honest, in my opinion, I did not think this was going to happen, but the S&P 500 came all the way back to the prior all-time high, and also this prior all-time high after we just broke above that all-time high back in 2022, and we back tested it, and we've seen a strong bounce. So kind of as a, well, hopefully worst case scenario, we are seeing a bounce from these very important levels on the S&P 500, but it's the same picture for the S&P 500 as well. You can see, and you can definitely argue, that the range lows back from all the way at the start of 2024, we have had a sharp SFP beneath this. We have started to recover back up to the upside. And for the S&P 500 on the daily, just kind of the same as Bitcoin, we are very, very neutral right now. They're both kind of forming doji candles depending on what chart that you're looking at. Not this one specifically for the S&P 500, but for a lot of the other ones, they are shaping up like doji candles. We did nuke down, we pushed back up, but on the daily, we are pretty much the exact same price that we opened at. So this is what I want to see for the S&P 500. It's very important that we get back above this resistance box. Round about 5.2 to 5.3, very steep resistance, but we've also come down to an area where there's been plenty of volume traded within this bull market. Not in terms of, that there are other places where we've traded a lot more volume. However, this is the second best bet. This is what you're looking at right now after this nuke to the downside. 5.2 thousand is going to provide a lot of steep resistance ahead for the S&P 500, and this is really where you want to see the S&P 500 start to get back above. You can see these previous resistance boxes, previous support boxes that we drew on the channel, we're now retesting these to the downside. So somewhat of a sticky situation, retesting the 1.236 from the previous Fibonacci of the all-time high down to the swing low. We came all the way up to the 2 extension and all the way back down to the previous all-time high. This is pretty much unheard of. Absolutely insane, and there's still more uncertainty ahead in the news. You can see that President Trump has threatened an additional 50% tariff on China if they don't withdraw their 34% tariff increase. You can see that President Trump has actually just cancelled one of his press conferences that he had scheduled with the Israeli Prime Minister after he flew all the way to the US to negotiate a new tariff deal. And the European Union says it's ready to discuss 0 for 0 tariffs with the US. So we're at a very interesting situation right now where the uncertainty index for what the president's doing is at all-time highs. The VIX is absolutely through the roof. Only last week this was at like 20, and it came up to as high as 60 today. And obviously the VIX kind of being a inverse of the S&P 500, you can see, let's just get rid of the stock. Every single time this has had a unprecedented spike to the upside. This is normally a blow off top for the VIX and a blow off bottom, or kind of like a worst case scenario bottom for the S&P 500. So it's kind of hard to imagine a world where the S&P 500 goes the VIX goes too much higher than this at this moment in time. We're kind of at pretty much bear market low positions for the VIX right now, which is absolutely insane. This has absolutely spiked through the roof all the way up to 60. The last spike it topped out at 65, and that marked a massive bottom followed by a V-shaped recovery for the S&P 500. And with the S&P 500 at the position that it's at right now, literally retesting the previous all-time high, I just find it a little bit tricky, a little bit uncertain. And what I really mean with this is, this whole kind of market situation is absolutely crazy right now. Uncertainty is at all-time highs, and just the fact that we're kind of at these levels right now, I think it only takes a few bullish news events to literally mark that as a bottom and full V-send recovery it to the upside. And with that being said, the same thing could happen on the inverse. We could continue to see further, terrible news developments that happen in the markets that we're going to need to keep up on, and we'll update you over on Twitter and over on the YouTube channel. But if this isn't the bottom and we get more bearish news and this rolls down, we are really going to see a unprecedented bear market and probably a lot more pain to come in the future. However, what do I think is going to happen next? That's the most important thing. That's why you clicked on the video. You probably want to know what I think is going to be happening next. Over on my channel, if you've been watching the past few videos, I have been leaning extremely neutral. In the past video as well, it was extremely neutral. I was 55% bullish, 45% bearish. So I pretty much told you exactly that. I told you I'm extremely neutral, but with the VIX at this kind of blow off top level, with the S&P 500 retesting its previous all-time high, and also one final chart that I want to show you. We showed you kind of all these macro charts with Bitcoin at the final level of support, holding these levels for the moment in time. But what we finally had right now is Bitcoin's actually come down and bounced on the 50 TMA on the weekly time frame. This is a absolutely monumental signal. And if we start closing weekly candles beneath this, and we don't see an immediate push back up above this, then I think it's going to be absolutely game over. However, with these levels on the VIX, with these levels on the S&P 500, and with Bitcoin retesting all of these super important levels right now, I think that's pretty much the worst case scenario over. And I myself posted over on Twitter this morning, pretty much when I woke up and saw all these charts, everything was red. I bought the spot. A lot of fear, uncertainty, panic, people kind of crying over these, retracements to the downside, back down to these historic support levels. This is the time when I want to be buying. So pretty much all of the available dry powder, all of the spare capital that I've had on the sidelines, waiting, and even capital that I probably shouldn't have invested. Capital that I invested today that is kind of really degenerative and kind of goes against a lot of the time, what traders say, don't kind of, I haven't invested anything I can't afford to lose. But let's just say if Bitcoin kind of breaks down from these levels, I'm going to be eating whole chickens again. I'm not going to be going to restaurants. I'm not going to be buying any more nice clothes. That's kind of pretty much the situation that I'll be in for the next month or so. And then I'll get the next payday and I'll be rolling again. Everything will be completely fine. So I definitely am not saying invest money that you can't afford to lose. I'm not saying invest, take a second mortgage out on your home. I'm not saying anything like that. What I'm telling you right now is if you've been watching the channel for the past videos, I've been extremely neutral. Right now, when everything has gone tits up and we've pretty much had one of the worst days in history for the S&P 500, with the S&P 500 melting down to the previous all-time high and Bitcoin melting down to the 50 TMA on the weekly time frame, this is actually the moment where a lot of people are terrified right now, and I'm moving my neutral stance into a very bullish stance. And I could be wrong. More news could come out, and this is why in this market specifically it's very kind of tricky to track, because this is a news-led market. But when we look back at the kind of historical trading of Bitcoin, we don't necessarily look back at the charts and remember the news events. We look back at the charts and we remember kind of how this traded according to technical analysis. Like, I don't even remember exactly where FTX was, somewhere in this crisis, but it formed the bottom and it retested some very, very important levels from the prior all-time highs, from the weekly candle body closes, and also the monthly candle body closes. Like, the monthly candle body closes pretty much almost nailed it, a couple of $1,000s off. But while news was leading this bear market back here, when we're looking back at it today, we can draw technicals and outline why the bottom could have been highlighted within that range. And if you've been trading throughout this market, sure, a lot of news events have led us to kind of come down, test the 50 TMA, followed by kind of bullish news events like the spot Bitcoin ETFs, which led us to come all the way back up. And then we've had bearish news bringing us all the way back down for the S&P 500, back down to the previous all-time highs, and back down for Bitcoin specifically to the weekly 50 TMA. So a lot of people, in my opinion, in 10 years time, no one's going to remember the news that came out today, but people are going to look at the charts, they're going to back test it, and they're not going to remember anything about Trump's tariffs back at these regions. They're not going to remember anything about Trump's tariffs back here. Potentially they will for the S&P 500, to be honest, because this is much more brutal. However, what people are going to remember and what people are going to look at 10, 15 years time, people who are coming new into the trading market, is they're going to look at these textbook retests of previous all-time highs following the technicals, and they're going to look at Bitcoin coming down to the 50 TMA. And if we bounce from this level, no one's going to remember the news. People are going to remember that every single time shit kind of went tits up in this bull market and we came down and back tested the 50 TMA, started off here, confirmed it back over here after closing another weekly above it, and potentially right here, no one's going to remember the news. No one looks back 5-10 years ago in Bitcoin's trading history and really remembers, exactly every single news event. I mean, people like myself that have been in this market for a while, we can remember the main ones, we can remember bear market, I don't even exactly remember. I think, oh, it was the ETF that came out. It was the ETF that came out here. It was COVID here. I can't remember what happened over on the top over here. It was FTX somewhere around about here. But everywhere else is kind of just noise. The news comes and goes, and I know that I've probably been talking about the news and kind of my sentiment on what I think is really going to carry the next step in the market for probably more than I've been doing the technicals on this video. But if there's kind of anything that I'm going to leave you with wrapping up the video today, it's that. No one's going to remember the news on what happened today 5 years from now. What people are going to remember is these textbook patterns. And in my opinion, what I'm doing at this moment in time is I'm shifting my very, very neutral bias that I've had in the past few videos. I'm shifting that into an extremely bullish bias at this moment in time while we are at these levels. And I can reevaluate that if the S&P 500 crashes beneath its previous all-time high. In my opinion, a bear market's going to ensue. If Bitcoin kind of crashes beneath the 50 TMA and starts closing 1 or 2 weekly candles, then I'll have a completely different stance in a couple of weeks' time and we'll be pretty much shifting into a bearish one. But at least as of right now, this is what I think. I think technicals are ruling the market. I think traders are finding kind of policy and news in order to trade that into the technicals, but no one's going to remember the news 5-10 years from now. I think we're at a very interesting spot for Bitcoin. Of course, back to the technicals, what I really want to see outside of the sentiment is I want to see Bitcoin trading back within this yellow box, within these 2 yellow boxes as soon as possible. If we do push back up and Bitcoin starts trading and closing around 82,000, then this may have been one of the craziest Black Mondays and swing failure patterns outside of our beautiful little orange range that we've been trading in for about a month and a half now, that we've had many potential many over here swing failure patterns out of and over of. So that's pretty much all I'm looking at right now. I'm extremely bullish on Bitcoin, not longing at this moment in time, really want to see some confirmations, but like I said, uncomfortably in spot, uncomfortably bought the dip this morning for Bitcoin, Solana, or I don't really trade the S&P 500, but specifically for the S&P 500, it is notable to say, and I do have to be completely honest with this, the S&P 500 looks a lot worse than Bitcoin right now, and I need to see Bitcoin, I need to see the S&P 500 back above 5,200 as soon as possible for this to start to look good, because at the end of the day, Bitcoin has been following what the S&P 500 has been doing, and it's all fine and dandy if the low is in at this previous all-time high and we start V-shaped recovering, which is, in my opinion, what I think we're going to be doing. But if we fall beneath this, completely different market, completely different sentiment. So the next week or so is going to be very important, and you know, like I mentioned, no one's going to remember the news kind of 5-10 years from now, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to see good news. I do want to see good news come out. If there's anything kind of major, I will retweet it over on Twitter with kind of the important ones, because I think an important news event is kind of all we need to see at this moment in time, shaping up the bottom. But what's that just going to look like? It's just going to relate back to the technicals. That's what we need to look at right now. We need to see Bitcoin remain above 76,500, closing weeklies above it, and start impulsing above. We've seen a nice V-shaped recovery so far. But if this trickles back down, if the S&P 500 comes back down to the previous all-time high and slips below, we'll re-update the bias. But at least for right now, I'm extremely bullish. We're at some kind of crazy levels that personally I didn't think, and I don't think a lot of other people thought that we were gonna kind of come back down to these levels. Happy to admit that. I don't think a lot of people expected this. That's completely fine. But we're at these kind of crazy levels right now, and at these levels, I really just can't be bearish. So happy to be proven wrong. Well, not happy to be proven wrong, but happy to admit I'm wrong if we do break back beneath the previous all-time high for the S&P 500 and retake out this low from today. That would invalidate what I'm currently saying. For Bitcoin specifically, I just want to see weekly closes remain above the 50 TMA at round about 77,000, let's say 77 to be safe. So that's all I've got for today. When we get a next major update, of course, I'll keep you up to date with what to expect next. But yeah, that's all for today. Again, no one's going to remember the news. Everyone's going to remember the technicals. don't be caught looking stupid if we do manage to close a weekly above the 50 TMA and we just have a sharp impulse back up to the upside, because that's going to be what everyone's kind of thinking is a news-led event, but it's really just going to be a textbook retracement of some important levels, holding these levels, getting a bullish confirmation, and heading back up, which is what I think is going to happen next. So all for today. Make sure you follow me over on Twitter at 618_cowboy. Smash like, leave a comment if you enjoyed. See you in the next one. I'm out. Peace.